Hello everybody, my name is Grace and today I'm going to continue reading the book Who Was Charles Darwin? Chapter 5 Secret Notebooks. From the Galapagos Islands, the Beagle headed to West Tahiti in South Pacific. Then it sailed to New Zealand and Australia and into the Indian Ocean. On the island of Mauritius, Charles has a special treat, an elephant ride. He was surprised such a large animal could walk so quietly. After a stop in South Africa, the Beagle sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and headed for England. The ship docked on October 2nd, 1836. 3 days later, Charles was back home. He was glad to see his father and the rest of his family. He had been away for 5 long years. The Beagle voyage had changed Charles' life. He was ready to pursue a career as a scientist. His father accepted this. There was no more talk of Charles becoming a minister. Right away, Charles set to work. He soon was meeting a famous scientist, like geologist Charles Lyell, whose book he had read. Now the two became close friends. Charles also began turning his Beagle diary into a book and spent hours sorting his collections. Charles needed the help of experts to identify his finds, so he gave away many specimens to museums. The museum experts told him some of his fossils did belong to unknown animals. Then, even more astonishing news. John Gould was an ornithologist, a scientist who studied birds. Gould could examine the finches Charles took from the Galapagos Islands. He looked at their feathers, the shape of their beaks, the length of their bones, and other things. But he wanted to know where each finch came from. But that was impossible because the birds hadn't been labeled that way. Charles contacted Captain Fitzroy and other crew members who also collect specimens. With their help, Gould and Charles were able to identify which finches came from which islands. Then Gould told Charles something astonishing. Birds on one island were not the same species as birds from the other island. They were 3 different species. Charles was amazed. He knew that in South America there was only one finch that looked like the finches in Galapagos Islands. Charles had assumed that the South American finch and all the Galapagos Island finches belonged to the same species. But John Gould said that was wrong. So Charles came up with some ideas about what might happen. Charles thought that perhaps some finches of the South American species had gone to Galapagos Islands long ago. Maybe a storm had blown them there, so at first there being only specimens, one species of finch on different islands. And somehow, from a common ancestor, the finches on various islands changed over time or evolved into different species. If the finches had changed, thought Charles, maybe other creatures could change too. He hadn't forgotten the giant and mallow fossils he found. Charles couldn't help wondering if armadillo fossils were related to the smaller lived armadillos he'd eaten. With his own eyes, Charles had seen that changes on Earth could take place through natural forces like volcanoes. It was impossible that plants and animals could also change through natural force. But what was that force and how did it work? Charles didn't yet know, but he made up his mind to find out. And so it began one of the most exciting times in Charles Darwin's life. He was on fire with questions. He poured his ideas into notebooks, which he carried everywhere. He wrote at the library, where he read his book after book. He scribbled down thoughts while bumping along London streets in a carriage. Charles also talked to people who worked with animals and plants. At the time, no one really understood inheritance. That is how traits are passed from one generation to another, like brown eyes, for example. But Charles guessed inheritance might be an important part of the puzzle. So Charles asked a barber, who raised dogs, about breeding hounds and good hunting instincts. He also went to the zoo, looked at animals, and chatted with zookeepers. Charles asked questions, listened carefully, and also looked closely. Yet, he never told anyone why he was so curious. Charles was leading a double life. To the outside world, he was rising star in science. He was famous for his voyage on the Beagle and his collections. He was invited to join an important group of scientists. But secretly, Charles was trying to solve a scientific puzzle. He didn't dare tell anyone what he was going on. Almost anyone Charles knew believed God had created the world. In just 6 days, the first horses and birds looked exactly the same at the beginning of creation as horses and birds did in Charles' time. But people weren't ready to accept that world. The world, as they knew it, they had become into being very slowly, and they were still changing. About 1838, Charles had a theory to explain how creatures could change. A lot of his thinking came from reading a book about human populations. Charles realized that living creatures produce lots of offspring. Birds, for instance, have many babies, but the world isn't overrun with birds. There aren't enough resources, enough space or food for all of them. Some birds die before they can have babies of their own. Others live longer. They are better fit to survive and have babies of their own. Charles knew there were many small differences or variations in individual members of a species. Take the finches in Galapagos Islands. At one time, long ago, there will probably have been only one species on all the islands. Even so, not all coast finches were exactly alike. For example, some finches may have been born with slightly thicker beaks than others. On an island with lots of hard seeds to eat, it was probably easier for the finches to eat with thicker beaks to eat seeds. Finches with longer, narrow beaks would have a harder time picking them up. So, on this island, the long-beaked birds might not have lived as long. Charles understood that a finch cannot change the shape of his beak during his lifetime, but he figured finches with short, thick beaks can eat more food and have a good chance of surviving long enough to have babies or offspring of their own. Their offspring will be part of the next generations of finches. If babies in the next generation inherit thick beaks too, they will be better fit to survive and have offspring their own. In other words, the fit members are having the most babies. Then each generation is more fit. The helpful trait, the thick beak, gets passed down, while unfit traits, for example the long narrow beak, don't get passed down as much. So each generation is more fit to survive. In this way, over many generations, the population of finches on islands with hard seas are adapting to the environment. Over time, the population may change so much that if they even eventually become separate species in the Galapagos Islands. Over time, the finch population on the island with hard seas to eat became to have thick, powerful beaks. Charles gets that his same force could explain changes in other creatures, such as the armadillos. He didn't know exactly what had happened, but he suspected that fossils could help provide important clues. Charles understood that all creatures struggle to survive. The struggle causes populations of plants, animals, and also bacteria to change. Charles called this work natural selection. Charles now had the key to part of the evolution puzzle. He had figured out something very important. but he wasn't ready to share his ideas to the world. So that is all of chapter 5, and I will see you in chapter 6. Bye!